project is actually, okay, I was just disturbed by the recording, whatever. I actually want to talk about smart cities as a site of negotiation. And I think that there are always things negotiated, also political aspects always negotiated, more or less explicit in all these fancy technology smartification projects. And so I want to focus on smart cities as these sites of negotiation. And why I think it's interesting, because they're pretty much emerging everywhere. And there are ongoing discussions about what smart means. I mean, this whole conference is to some extent about the question, what does smart mean? But I want to focus more on what is the city actually. And I think it's interesting to focus on that, because when we look at cities, we see a huge variety of actors. So all of these actors, I guess, have different perceptions of what the city is, and they also have different perceptions of why the city should become smart. But what is interesting when we look at these smart city projects, at least to what I observed so far, is that often we see cooperations and collaborations forming. So in the city where I live here in Munich, I hear claims like, yeah, the administration is not innovative enough, so we need to partner up with the researchers, we need to partner up with companies and startups in order to achieve these actual smart cities. So there's always this kind of deficit perspective towards the public sector. And so all these different actors are to some extent engaged in these smart city projects. I also put it states there. I mean, I could also have put the European Union there. I think it's very interesting also that all these funding schemes and all this money providers extensively shape the way how this smartification is going. And I think also that some cities are also doing it just because if there is funding, which also makes it an interesting question again on the smart part. But let's stay with the city part for some more time. So what I assume to be there is obviously different conceptions or conceptualizations what the city actually is. We can arrive at a conception of the city historically by examining how cities like physically emerged. We can also look at different disciplines, like for example, city planning, to see what cities are. But I identify two kinds of poles that are driving my research interests, and I want to quickly introduce them. So one of them, which it's also important to mention that I consider these different conceptions of the city also to be possible to be assigned to the different actors I just introduced. So for example, for a lot of startups, they go to cities because they consider cities, but it is complicated, as a gathering of people who are actually in demand of different services or products. And so the city is like physically literally the place where these trades are, where these goods are traded. So we consider there are some people and they want to buy stuff, and so this is like the place where we can actually trade. And these services that we provide, for example, as a company or as a startup or whatever, are to fulfill the citizens' needs. So we definitely want to support people in this community, but it's done through negotiations about price. And quite diametral to that is actually this perspective of what in Germany we call Daseinsvorsorge. I think public service is some kind of translation for that, but I think the Daseinsvorsorge discourse is even more special in Germany because we actually have also strong legal requirements for municipalities to provide some services, and there's huge debates about what that includes and what not. But basically it says we need to ensure basic human needs as a municipality. And there is actually this legal commitment to fulfill these needs for their citizens, either without costs or at costs that are affordable for everyone. So this is like this thought of inclusion and bringing people together as a community. And also to mention, there are definitely different realities of cities, which is interesting for me in the empirical design, because obviously either whether you're a capital of a state or whether you are just in rural areas and have like 10,000 inhabitants is definitely making a difference. So where are we? Yes, I said something about Daseinsvorsorge. I also said something about the specific situation I consider it to be in German. What is interesting is that there are current debates about which areas are actually part of Daseinsvorsorge. So we can, for example, speak about education, but there's also people considering mobility, this kind of basic human right. There's also people who say access to digital tools, or at least access to the internet, should also be part of this Daseinsvorsorge or public service. So we definitely see discussions about like opening up the space of Daseinsvorsorge, especially also in times of neoliberalization of cities and like globalization. But we also have like a contrary discussion in this field of Daseinsvorsorge, which is basically who is responsible for delivering these goods and services. So far it was the task of the municipalities, and now what we see is kind of a shift that also there's public-private partnerships, but there's also more and more privatization of infrastructures. There's privatization of actually these very central parts of public service. Why is that all relevant? I think it's very relevant because the values that we approach some projects with, or the values that we approach these smart city projects with specifically, actually influence the strategies that we're building. I mean, the partners that we're sitting at the table definitely make a difference, because all these partners bring their different values and their conceptions of the cities with them. And the technologies that we build together are actually in the end embodying these values. What I brought to you is a screenshot of a mobility app of the city of Munich, and what you can see very much like all these dots represent some smart bikes or cars sharing things or whatever. And what you can see is a very strong tendency towards the center of cities. And this is not like accidentally, but this is because most of these services are actually provided by people who consider the city to be a market. And obviously in the city center, the market opportunities are much better. So when we talk about access to these services, and when we take Daseinsvorsorge seriously, we obviously get issues with these different conceptualizations that people bring to the table.
You're about halfway through, Benedict.
That's perfect. And also what I think why it's important to look at these things in the context of smart city. I mean, discussions about access and discussions about inclusion, and also discussions about public service in general are not new, but why is it so important to discuss these in the context of these smartification processes? When you open your mobile phone and you're entering this mobility app, you actually as a user don't have the chance to negotiate with someone. All these digital infrastructures are kind of mediators between the people who build them and, on the other hand, the people who use them, but they are not in direct contact anymore. And so also the customers or the citizens have it much harder to have a say in what is actually going on. And so the way how we design these digital infrastructures kind of manifest and kind of construct very hardly how we organize the access to those goods and services. So I think this is of importance to keep in mind when we talk about smartification. So what is possible to look at when having all this in mind? I think that there are three interesting phases that all these smart city projects go through, and all of them are to some extent relevant for the questions that I have in mind. So this is obviously the task I'm confronted with, to kind of focus and to find there like an entrance point. But when we look at the initiation phase, I already said before that all these funding schemes are actually motivating cities to actually think in such a direction. And while the European Union actually has no legal possibility to intervene in what's happening in municipalities, they still do have in the way how they actually shape their funding schemes and how they set up their criteria. So the criteria that we see there might give us an information about what do people actually consider relevant for the cities of the future. And this also says something about their perspective on cities. Then after maybe a successful application for funding, or maybe also funded by the cities themselves, we go into these strategy development processes. And I consider this to be the most interesting part from my research, actually. And I'm planning to actually try to sit on these tables where these strategies are negotiated. Because what I assume to be, and this is to be found out in the project actually, is that there is no explicit discussion about what is the city that we want to smartify, but there's rather, what kind of use cases do we have? What kind of potential products can we offer? So I think that these strategy building processes are of vital importance when we speak about making values explicit. And this is also maybe the chance to actually do some interventions and to also participate in these workshops actively, to also ask questions or raise questions like that to see how people react. And yeah, the third part, the implementation, I already showed a screenshot of the mobility app. I think also looking at services that are already there and trying to trace back these frames and conceptions from the strategy processes in the implementation to actually make it visible kind of is relevant for this so what question of my research project, namely how do these implementations and these different conceptions actually impact different societal groups. So guiding assumption, this is to be found out in the project, but you always start with an idea of what you assume to be, that you want to prove or falsify. I think that this common goal of smartification and the smart part of the city is such a strong claim, and it's such a big narrative that people actually buy in without an explicit negotiation of what they actually consider to be the city. So the smart part of the city is much higher weight than the city part of the smart city. And just to provide one potential also conceptual framing, which is also something I did in my master thesis on hackathons, by actually leaving it unclear what smart or what city actually means. A lot of people can bring their stuff to the table. A lot of people can collaborate without even collaborating in the end. So if we consider this smart city as a boundary object, we also have a theoretical frame that allows us to look on these things that are happening there. So in the end, smartification is the common interest that everybody has, but the reasons why people actually have this interest and also the motivations they have behind this interest are way different. And this is something that I assume and I want to find out in my project, and I hope that I could give you insight. I definitely enjoyed being part of this. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to all the questions you might potentially have.
Thank you ever so much, Benedict. And it's also good to see you. I think Marseille left some greetings from the Ethos Lab in the chat. Benedict was a visiting researcher in Copenhagen not so long ago.